Grief doesn't keep a calendar. Anxiety doesn't clock out after 5. Depression doesn't care if it's your busy season. But support can still fit into your life. With Grow, you can find a therapist who meets you where you are. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions. You can search by insurance, provider specialty, treatment methods, and more to find a therapist who works for you. And if it's not the right fit, switching is easy. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Find therapy on your time. Evenings, weekends, and cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/ACAST today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/ACAST. growtherapy.com/ACAST. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
How does F1 turn data into insights at 200 miles per hour? AWS is how fans get inside the strategy. AWS powers next-level innovation for millions of businesses.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.
Welcome to Aran Island Discs, a podcast series where we talk to Irish people from different walks of life as they reflect on their own journeys. Join me, Russell McDermott, as we explore the many aspects of Irishness and what it means to each of our guests through life's ups and downs. Kevin Cullen, welcome to Aran Island Discs.
Thanks, Russell. Appreciate it.
Now, the first question is a trick one. Have you been to the Aran Islands?
I've been there exactly twice. I first traveled there about 45 years ago when I was a student at Trinity College in Dublin. For some reasons that illustrate me, Russell, Trinity accepted me, working class kid from Boston. So I dropped out. I had to drop out of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst because they did not have a program, an exchange program with Trinity. So when I was at Trinity, I hitchhiked from Ranelagh, where I had a bed sit, to Connemara. And I know when I used to tell people that what are you out of your mind? It was so different back then. I mean, I as I recall, I think I had 5 or 6 rides across the country, and I don't think I waited for a lift for more than 10 minutes. I think
what amazed you about that story, Kevin, is the concept of hitching. If I said that to my daughters at 25, 26, they'd look at me and say, what? Hitchhiking?
And I remember when I would go back, even in the 80s and 90s, I was picking up hitchhikers, and sometimes it would be a solitary girl in the country, down the country. And I'd go, "You got to be kidding me!" So I'd get her in the car and I'd give her the dad lecture. Like, what are you doing?
What are you doing here?
I could be an American Psycho. In fact, I am an American Psycho. Get out of the car. But no, so I hitchhiked out to Connemara, and I just remember I was like walking. I walked from Carrow, where my grandmother Bridget Conley was from, to Cummis, where Upper Cummis, Upper Cummis, where my grandfather Martin Flaherty was from. And I remember the bogs were popping. It was eerie. It was like dusk, and that was the longest I waited for a ride. I mean, it was a bit. Yeah. Because there aren't that many people out there, and so it's dusk, and the bogs are popping like spontaneous combustion. I'm going, waiting for something to come out of the bogs. But anyway, I got a lift down to Rossaville the next day because I stayed at like a B&B. And took the ferry over. I believe it was the Dunangus. And I just walked around the island. I only went for the day that time, which was from what I could see that very few people stayed over unless they were natives, if they were locals, So I just remember it had to be Inishmore, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it would be from us.
And I just meandered about the place. And one of my aunts, Barbara Hayhurst, did a lot of I never did the ancestry thing, which I really regret. And someday I will do it. But she did a lot of research. And I remember her when I was like a teenager, her telling me that our family, that the Flahertys were O'Flahertys and that they were on the Aran Islands. And at some point in like I believe the 19th century, at some point, they just said, this is enough. Let's go to the mainland. And then they settled around Cummins and Upper Cummins. And so that was, I was just walking around the island. It was so like rustic. And so I just remember saying, how the hell do people live here? And this was like 1980. But I'm thinking about my ancestors living on this place, even within the last 150 years. It just amazed me. But so that was just
the weather that day was good.
It was, as I recall, very good. I don't remember getting rained on at all, but that first time, and again, I was only on the island for hours as I took the evening ferry or the late afternoon ferry back. But years later, so that was about 5 years later, I went back with a little money in my pocket. And my wife and I dated for about 2 years before we married in South Boston. And in 1985, about 6 months before we got married, we did a 10-day tour of Ireland. We hit some beautiful Blue Book
places,
guest houses. Geez, they were lovely. And they were crazy money back then, Rosa.
Yeah.
They really weren't. They were a lot cheaper than.
Well, that Blue Book was a very quiet secret in those days.
It was,
Kevin, because I was coming back from Spain. I was in the States by then. It was very kind of places off the beaten track you wouldn't know about, and they were very reasonably priced.
Absolutely, and we just, it was great. But we went out of our comfort zone and went to got back on the Dunangus and went out there. And we made arrangements at a very particular place because it was owned by the aunt, a B&B owned by the aunt of a fellow I played ice hockey with in West Roxbury. And he was, his name was Tommy. He was kind of a character, but his people were from Connemara like mine. And we go, oh yeah, you got to stay with my aunt. So he goes, but Tommy says, I talked to her. She's very happy to receive you, but I got to tell you, my aunt Teresa is super Catholic.
Yeah.
And I said, how Catholic? She's really Catholic. Like she's very Catholic. I go, oh, okay, whatever. So Martha, my wife, but then my fiance, we take the midday boat over from Russellville, and we're looking at all the natives on the boats, and they look like my cousin Jackie, Uncle William, God Almighty. So anyway, we walk up to the B&B, not that far from the pier, and introduce ourselves to Tommy's aunt Teresa, and she was lovely. But she was one of those Irish women who end every sentence with a sharp intake of breath. And we thought she had asthma. We didn't know what's going on. So anyway, she was lovely. She showed us around the place and gave us these super Catholic rules about being in her B&B. And, before we headed off to walk down to the village pub near the pier and all this, she goes, "You're married," Thomas says. And Mark and I looked at each other, and I turned to her and I said,
"Yes,
I would love and live with this woman the rest of my life." And Teresa looks at me very suspiciously. So anyway, Martha and I cycled borrowed bikes down to the pub, the light hanging on. It was just brilliant. And we got there it was late. We got there around 11. And being Americans, we had no idea that the pub would be full. It was full.
Yeah.
And we found out shortly after ordering a pint that it was full because all the natives, all the locals were there to watch that TV show Dallas.
Oh.
Now, I just remember from Father Ted when the crazy guy played by Pat Short, he has that shirt that says, "I shot JR." You remember that?
Yeah. It's a big thing.
In that episode of Father Ted.
Yeah, who shot him?
I think his name is the character's name is Tom.
Yeah.
Father Ted goes to him, "How are you, Tom?" He goes, "Father, I killed a man."
JR.
Ted goes, "Oh, that's great. That's lovely, but I can't talk. I'm doing a tele interview or something like that." Anyway, but at that time, I don't know if you recall, if you were in Ireland at that time or you were in America, but I think you're still in Ireland.
Yeah.
So the Irish were more fascinated with Dallas than the Americans.
In fact, Larry Hagman became a hero. He used to come and do the races and to make appearances. Because he didn't know who shot JR.
To me, I always thought it was like the inverse relationship. It's like Americans would watch The Quiet Man and say, "Oh, that's what Ireland is like," And I said, "Jesus Correct. And then like Irish people would watch Dallas and, oh, that's what America's like. The funny thing is, Martha and I had never watched Dallas. Not once.
Why would you?
So, no, I mean, geez, who cares? But we're sitting in the pub, and the atmosphere was brilliant. And the TV was on the bar. You know, they didn't have a TV in the wall or anything. This was 1980.
Just
in the
bar, yeah.
So at like, I don't know, 11:30 in the middle of the show, who comes in but the local guard sergeant? I'm saying, oh, jeez, we're screwed. You know, he's going to cite everybody. He's going to shut the bar down. And he looked like pissed off when he came in. And oh, here we go. But then he like looks at the TV, the crowd. They all, how are you, Seamus? He's rubbing his hands together. He nods to the bartender who starts pulling a pint for him. And he sits right down next to me and Martha. And he goes, how is you? I go, Jesus. So anyway, so we watched Dallas, had a couple of pints. And by the time we get out, I don't know, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said, how the hell are we going to find the B&B? And Martha said, well, it was down that hill. I go, we're going to drive down the hill. So we get on the bikes and, you know, we're not pedaling. We're just gliding, going. And I just remember all of a sudden I'm just going straight, hoping I don't hit a ditch. And I go, I'm going to die on Inishmore, off lying about being married when I'm not married. It's going to be a scandal all over the Irish press. So anyway, all of a sudden I hear this barking and there's a dog at my side. And I can feel the dog against my leg. And I go, he's going to take a chunk out of my leg. Anyway, I got to tip my cap to the dog because he brought us to the B&B, you know, barking all the way. So anyway, that was our second experience. And the next morning, I mean, I knew this was going to happen.
Do you explain yourself?
So we're there, and this is, you know, Teresa's pouring us tea, and we're laboring over a fry, slightly hungover. We still got, you know, we're not feeling that great. So she's pouring Martha's tea, and she looks at Martha's hand and say, oh, I see. And then she turns to me, I see you haven't got her a ring yet. So I was mid-sip of the tea. I put it down. I closed my eyes briefly, and I'm conjuring a response. And I finally concluded the only thing reasonable to do was to be honest, tell her the truth, that we were posing as a married couple because, on the advice of her own nephew, we were told to ask to share a bedroom as an unmarried couple was tantamount to throwing a child up the top of the Empire State Building. And I said, oh, Teresa, you know, you've hit on it. And as much as I wish you hadn't, I somehow am glad you did. And I turned to Martha and I said, Martha, I love you more than I could ever explain. I haven't bought you a ring yet because I have not yet come across an array of diamonds and gemstones that come close to capturing your life, your beauty. I will, however, never stop trying to find that stone, whatever it costs, however long it takes. So this is Teresa just sighs heavily, throws her hands up in the dish towel over her shoulder and says, oh, for fuck's sake.
And then I wonder how you got into journalism. Your way with words obviously got you in a lot of trouble.
No, that's the bullshit artist. Oh my God. It was funny that Martha and I tell that story to this day because it's so funny. And you know, now, and no one would bat an eyelash.
Absolutely. But so endemic of the art in that time, Kevin. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Now it's unimaginable because we're so trendy, modern, etc., etc. But in those days, people of that ilk nature looked for the wedding ring as a big thing to see where's your culture.
Teresa was probably thinking, if she let these American, you know, the harlots from Boston and nutbag boyfriend sleep together in the same room, that, you know, the parish priest would read her out at the altar. You know, contributing to the carnal delinquency of two loser Americans. But it was like that. It was like really that the church influence back then was suffocating. And I mean, I sensed that as an American.
Well, you would have noticed it more because in Ireland, we didn't really realize unless you traveled. But it was so suffocating in many ways. And our parents replicated that. It just became way of life. So you would have noticed it coming from Boston even.
Well, I came from a pretty Catholic background. You know, my mother would have been, you know, my mother, Margaret, or we call Peggy. Yeah. And I always laugh because that was the character in Playboy of the Western World, Peggy and Mike. Yeah. Her real name is Margaret Flaherty, Peggy Flaherty. Yeah. That was my mother. Yeah. She was Margaret Flaherty from South Boston. And she would have had the exact same attitude as Teresa. So I didn't judge Teresa
Yeah.
I just try to manage the situation.
Yeah, but they also had to adapt. It's the same way that you say your parents used their fluent Irish to talk around the kids so you wouldn't understand, but didn't pass on the language to you. When people went abroad, Irish people particularly, you adapted to circumstances and used things that worked and other things you had to leave behind, because Boston, can be a very waspish kind of place,
Yeah. Oh, it was. And, my grandparents came here, my maternal grandparents, who were both Irish speakers, came here, just at the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s. And, my grandmother came here more or less as an indentured servant. She was like a teenager.
Yeah.
She had to pay for her passage. And, she met my grandfather who, she grew up in Carrow, and my grandfather grew up in Arsa's rural way in Cummas, in Upper Cummas.
Upper Cummas.
And yet they didn't know each other.
The Upper Cummas and Lower Cummas are very different, I reckon. Are they?
I've tried to figure it out over the years. I've walked those blogs, but I still can't explain it to you, Ross. But anyway, this is to me the kind of the classic American immigrant story. Mm-hmm. So they grew up, so close to each other and yet never met there.
Wow.
And then they arrive in Boston as a teeming immigrant community. And I'm told they met at a dance, which was very common with Irish immigrants in the 20th century in Boston and New York and places like that. And they got married at St. Peter's and Paul's Church in South Boston in the lower end of Southie. And, never bought a house. Lived on one floor of a 3-decker on East 2nd Street, where my mother, my Aunt Mary, my uncles Johnny, Red, Pat, am I missing anybody? Willie, Uncle Willie, he was my godfather. They all grew, there was like 6 kids, or 7, no, my mother had 6 siblings. So they grew up on one floor in a 3-decker, never bought a home. And yet, they were able to produce all these kids that went off and did fairly well. But it is sad to me I was told by somebody who taught us sociology. I think her name was Hilary Tovey. She was my sociology professor at Trinity. And she talked about this thing when she was explaining why I was there. I was like, I don't know why I'm here. She called it third generation return, in which the grandchildren of immigrants identify with their home, with the country of their grandparents.
Yeah.
And they feel this longing. And I said, wow, yeah, that does something like me. But, my grandparents associated the Irish language. And when I explain this to young Irish people today, they look at me like I have 2 heads, that the Irish language, even among the Irish, was associated with cultures and the rural Ireland and poverty, and the people who did the worst in the famine, because it was, to hell or conic. And so my grandparents purposely did not pass the language on to my mother and her siblings. And that was very, very common. Not only common, I think it was very rare that Irish immigrants in the early 20th century would teach their kids the Irish language. Because, again, there was also pressure to assimilate back then.
Yes.
They were in their little enclave in South Boston or West Roxbury or Roxbury or Dorchester or Brighton and Charlestown. That's where all the Irish neighborhoods in Boston were. And they had their dances and all that stuff, and St. Patrick's was a big deal. But at the end of the day, they were desperate to assimilate. They were desperate to prove they were Americans. And sadly, one of the ways they were able to prove that was to not pass the language on, which I think is tragic and sad. And but the funny story that my Aunt Barbara told me, that she did all the research in the family, and she would have known. My grandfather Martin died before I was born, but my grandfather Martin worked for the gas company. It was very dangerous work back then when they were first laying the pipes under the ground and all that stuff. And he would have had a lot of co-workers who were Black. And I mean, that's what you have to remember. Boston in the early part of the 20th century, the sort of the Protestant upper class who ran the town, the Brahmins, they would have put the Blacks and the Irish in the same.
Correct.
It's like that old line from The Commitments, They would have considered the Blacks and the Irish no different. Like, we can lose these guys. We replace them easy enough.
Yeah.
So my cousin, my grandfather Martin, apparently one day, he was known for making a very strong poutine, and he made it in the bathtub of the bathroom on the second floor of East Second Street, three-decker. So my grandmother was out there doing the shopping, and she comes home one day and she hears like, hysterical laughter coming from the bathroom. So she goes in there, and there's my grandfather with like 3 black guys from work, and they're hammered, hammered drunk on the poutine, and my. So my grandmother looks at my grandfather at the black guys, and in Irish, she says, "Marcin, what will the neighbors think?" And of course, my grandfather's sitting there, half in the wrapper, with his long clay pipe, and he says to her in English, he says, "Delia," because that was her pet name. "Delia, you're in America now. Speak American." I love that story. And the black guys are just like, they're blessed. And then, fast forward a generation or two, and all the racial animus that was in South Boston because of the school busing. Yeah. I always tell, whenever I tell my cousins in Southie, because I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Malden, which is, Southie with trees. Yeah. I tell my
it was north. There was more north than Southie, though. It's kind of cool, really.
But I used to tell my cousins, like, hey, our grandfather used to hang out. He had friends who were black guys. So they didn't want to hear that.
Yeah. Anyway. But the same way cultural things that Asians probably have a better value for education. What I admire in your story is the fact that Bozo Flaherty insisted you seek education, which Irish people probably weren't as programmed to consider as Koreans and other people who came to America in those days.
Yeah, Bozo was my Uncle Johnny. He was the
great name. I hope it's meant affectionately.
Everybody in Southie had the nickname. All the cousins who are Flahertys, their nicknames they call them Flabbo. Hey Flabbo. Hey Bobo. Hey Naco. Hey Jocko. I was like, they were like, my cousins would point out, because I spent a lot of time. My mother insisted on going to South Boston every Sunday, where she and my Aunt Mary would tell the same stories over and over. They never changed. They tell the same story every week. But my father would say, we would cross over the Northern Avenue Bridge from downtown Boston into South. He goes, kids, watch your mother. She changes once we cross the bridge. But my cousins would tell me, like you say, you're from Malden. You don't get a nickname. Yeah. So I was denied a nickname because I didn't grow up in South Boston, which is just as well. I mean, God, I can only imagine what my nickname would have been. But my Uncle Johnny was a Boston firefighter, and my dad was a firefighter in Malden. And by all accounts, Patrick Cullen, who was my father's grandfather, the first Cullen who came here, went through Ellis Island and was actually held on Ellis Island because he was too dumb to realize that when they asked for his political party, he said, "I have none." But then they said, "Well, you have to have some kind of and he said he was a socialist. You didn't say that back then.
Lock him up.
And like guys from he was from Kildare, and guys that were already established here, they visited him in Ellis Island. They go, geez, Pat, you just tell them what they want to hear. Yeah. Eventually, he got off. He got on the New York Fire Department, and then eventually moved up to Malden, Massachusetts, and was a firefighter there. So firefighting is a huge part of my family tradition, literally from the very first emigrant who arrived. And right through to my dad. And I was pretty sure that that's what I was going to do, because I don't know. But at some point, I realized I do not have the courage to run into a burning building.
These ladders.
Yeah. So I went to see, and I was like a student. I was about to graduate from high school. I applied to like 3 or 4 colleges because they didn't have the money to do any more than that. Now kids apply to 16, 20 colleges. Yeah. But and I went and saw my Uncle Bozo at the firehouse on D Street in Southie, and he was there just sitting there reading the paper. And I went in, I told him what was going on. I'm thinking of taking the fire exam. And he goes, "Well, why don't you go to school?" I said, "Well, what am I going to do? I mean, my parent, mom doesn't have any money. Dad doesn't have any money." He goes, yeah, but you'll be able to do it. And he goes, "Go to school. If you still want to do it, the job will be here. Don't worry about it." And it was good advice. So I went to school. And again, I mean, after talking to my Uncle Bozo, there was no chance I was ever going to be a firefighter. But And he gave great advice. And he was one of these guys. He was always reading. And when I went into the firehouse that day, he was reading some book. I don't know what the book was, but the guy was always reading. And again, it was probably the best advice I ever got, because my parents were very agnostic on it. They were like, yeah, you want to go to school, go to school. And so I went to UMass Amherst because basically it was the only school I thought I could afford. And I didn't want to get saddled with crazy debt. And that turned out great. And in terms of Ireland, my sophomore year, I took an Irish history course with a professor named Joe Herndon. Mm. And he was brilliant. And I remember we had to read the Constitution, Aran, and I had to read all these things. But the other thing that Joe did, I think, which was brilliant, is that he had us read Irish writers. Because Joe said you can't understand Irish history if you don't understand Irish literature. And I think that's quite true. So that sophomore year, that year I was reading, I read Joyce, I read Shaw, I read Swift, I read Oscar Wilde, I read Edna O'Brien, one of her earliest. Yeah. Joe was telling us to read was it The Country Girl or something?
Country Girls, yeah.
This was wild, that this was published about
obscene.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
But I mean, it really lit that fire, that third generation return that my professor at Trinity later told me about. And I was obsessed with getting to Ireland. And initially it was the only program that UMass had transfer, like an exchange with, was the University College Cork. But I didn't want to live in Cork. I wanted to live in Dublin because I read Dublin 2 or 3 times in about 4 months. I just loved it.
So your first time to Ireland was when you went to Trinity?
Literally. I got on, and this is such an Irish story too. I worked at my summer job was at a place called Bolt, Beranek and Newman in Cambridge, Mass. And I worked in the copy shop. I made copies, on a big copying machine. And the woman who ran the canteen, Noreen, was an old lady. And she was from, I forget where she was from, but boy, she was Irish. And she was like my Nana, she looked like my Nana from Cork and Castletownbere and all this. And she was just always on me and sweet on me. And did I have a lunch? And she'd slip me a sandwich if I didn't have a sandwich. But when I told her I was going to go to Trinity, she was like, wow. She goes, well, have you ever been to Ireland? I said, no. She goes, well, who are you going to meet when you get there? I'm not going to meet anybody. I have a family at Rathfarnham I'm living with. She goes, well, you can't get off the plane and not have anybody. So Noreen called these people that she knew in Swords near the airport. Yeah. I think it was her niece or something. And their name was Cullen. Just by coincidence, no relation. So when I got off the plane, they were the Cullen family, a man, a guy, his wife, and 2 or 3 little kids. They have greeted. We're holding a sign, welcome Kevin or something. Yeah. And I go over, they take me to their house in Swords, a very short distance from the airport. And I was jet lagged out of my mind. Yeah. I had never, this was the overnight flight. Yeah. So they put me to bed. And these are total strangers, and it had a real profound impact on me because it was the first time I really experienced that sort of Irish hospitality and the sort of kindness and generosity that many, if not most, Irish people possess. The idea that they would just pick up somebody, they didn't know who I was.
Pick up a stranger at the airport and the instructor is somebody even thousands of miles away. Yeah.
And, Noreen told them, you got to pick them up. And so I woke up and I remember the first meal, home cooked meal, all the veg, the big chunks of potato and big chunks of carrots and turnip, and it was lamb. And I remember taking the first bite of it and it tasted like it still had the wool on it. But I said, Jesus, I can't insult this family. Ross, I'm telling you, it took me, thank Christ, there was a dog there. And the dog kept coming up to me. And I kept feeding that dog. I gave him half the lamb, but I had to do it every time the parents weren't looking. Yeah. And one of the boys, he was probably like 8. He noticed me doing it, and he just looked over and winked. Yeah. And he didn't rat me out.
Well, didn't have to bribe him or anything, pay him a few quid.
So anyway, the only other time I saw that family, right around Christmas time, I was most of the Americans I knew at Trinity came from more than a little money. Yeah. They tended to be pretty well off. Yeah. So they were all going on holidays at Christmas time. They're all traveling to France and Spain and London, whatever. And I had no money. I had nothing. I tried to get a job at Arnott's, and then it's gun store.
Yeah.
And the unemployment rate was 20%.
That's right. Different times.
They were going to hire an American kid.
Ahead of
I literally couldn't work. So I was so broke. But I was able to scrape up enough money to go, and I got the kids, the Cullen kids, like 3 Irish language, like, not coloring books, but just books that are aimed for kids about, I think one was about Cullen and all that. And I brought it and I took the bus out to Swords, and I walked like wherever to get to the house. I found the house. I knocked on the door, and it was brilliant because they brought me in. I just had tea and biscuits, and the kids were really lovely and hugged me and all that stuff. And that was like the only thing that I really did that Christmas up until Stephen's Day. And it was brilliant. And I felt, I was very lonely that first year. That first Christmas. It was the first time I felt really homesick. But the next day, on Stephen's Day, I got invited to, my friend was traveling, but the family, we lived in Rathfarnham. And I didn't last very long there because the family was, the father worked for Bulger, and the mother was a former nun. She left the convent to marry this guy. And it was the only time in my life I would have encouraged somebody to stay in the convent because this guy was a jerk. He was unbelievably, they clearly had me as a boarder for the money. I mean, it was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And so Pat, the woman, she was lovely. She was really nice. But her husband was he was just highly agitated. He was always moving, and he had like ADHD or whatever he had. He just was really difficult to be around. And he treated me he didn't treat me well. And so his rule was I had to be home at 6:00. And if I wasn't home at 6:00, then I got no dinner, even though I was paying for dinner, room and board. And I tried to explain to him. I said, Ronnie, I'm a student. I have classes a couple days a week that are at like 4:00. I don't even get out of class till like close to 5:30. I can't get a bus and get back to Rathfarnham. And the other thing that happened, the buses were on strike all the time back then. And so were the banks. It was unbelievable. So this guy, basically, I very often didn't eat. Wow. And finally, I got like drunk one night, I think in frustration, threw up on my bed. And I took it to the laundry, trying to launder it because I was so embarrassed. And Ronnie went into the room, saw that the sheets were there, and called the guards.
Seriously?
And they were going to arrest me for stealing sheets. And I had to explain
what you were doing. What
I was doing. I was embarrassed. I threw up in my sheets, and I wanted to wash them myself, and I didn't want Pat to have to do it. And I remember Pat was just lovely and just said, "Don't worry about it, Kevin, and I'll clean them." And Ronnie said, "No, you're out of here." So he basically threw me out. And it was the best thing he ever did for me, given that he was a jerk.
Yeah.
And I was able to find a bed sit in Ranelagh, and it was by chance because an American graduate student, Tom something or other, was leaving after the first term of the 3 terms. He had just finished his master's. And he said that, it was like, I want to say it was 10 or 15 quid a week. And I said, wow, that's great. So I went and met the landlady. Her name was Mrs. Gallagher. And I saw pictures on the wall. There was a picture of her with Michael McLeamore and Hilton Edwards, the founders of the Gate Theater.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, you know them?" And then she looked at me and she goes, "You know them?" I said, "Yeah, I've read about them."
Yeah. And
she goes, "Well, when are you going to move in?" That was the interview. Because I knew who Edwards and McLeamore were.
Yeah.
And she was lovely. But boy, was I homesick after moving in. And I just remember how cold it was. And it was one of those bed sits you had to put like a 10p piece in for to get the heat.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, so I'd sit in my bed sit, put the 10p in, and then like after, I don't know, a couple hours, I said, I'm just going to put more covers on the bed because I need these 10p pieces to get up. So I slept, and I'd wake up in the morning, and you could see the frost. It was like I was living in an igloo. But it was also just a great experience. And Ranelagh was a great place. I would walk to school.
That's right. Handy.
Took me about, and I got up, I got a lot of exercise. But the other thing I learned about in Ranelagh was particularly on weekends, on like Saturday mornings or Sunday mornings, I'd walk by these things that I thought were like horse droppings.
Grief doesn't keep a calendar. Anxiety doesn't clock out after 5. Depression doesn't care if it's your busy season, but support can still fit into your life. With Grow, you can find a therapist who meets you where you are. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions. You can search by insurance, provider specialty, treatment methods, and more to find a therapist who works for you. And if it's not the right fit, switching is easy. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Find therapy on your time. Evenings, weekends, and cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/ACAST today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/ACAST. growtherapy.com/ACAST. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
How does F1 turn data into insights at 200 miles per hour? AWS is how fans get inside the strategy. AWS powers next-level innovation for millions of businesses.
And I later figured out it was a combination of Guinness and fish and chips and people being sick.
The morning after, the night before stuff.
Yeah, I remember having to dodge that. It was like, you'd have to keep your eye down on the footpath or you'd step in this stuff. It was
something that hasn't changed, Kevin, so it still happens.
When we lived in Dunleary, we're right up the street from Georgia Street where the Abacadabra was. Yeah. That was the work, I'm telling you. It was like trying to go through a minefield with my little kids at the time. I said, Dad, what's that? I go, Dad, I said, that's Declan's supper.
Yeah. I didn't realize you lived in Dunleary so many years, actually.
I only lived in Dunleary in 97 and 98 when the Globe moved me over there. But we had a lovely experience there. And this is the other thing I tell people. Because
I used to think you used to commute over to do the stories. I didn't realize you actually based here
for about 20 years, the Globe sent me over, not 20, what am I saying? Probably in the late 80s. Because I remember I asked Steve Earle, I thought Northern Ireland was a story that was badly underreported in all American newspapers. But I thought especially in Boston, because I argued it was an international story that was a local story. That so many people in Ireland, so many people in the Boston area, our readership was overwhelmingly Irish American. It wasn't even close to any other ethnic group being that close. And so Northern Ireland was a local story to them. They wanted to know more about it. So when I was like, I got to the Globe. I worked for 2 years at the Boston Herald, which was run by Murdoch.
Yeah.
I actually was the union president at the Boston Herald when I was the police reporter, which meant I worked like 70 or 80 hours a week. And the only good thing I did as a union president, I got us affiliated with the Newspaper Guild, and it really narrowed the wage gap between the Herald and the Globe. But I went to the Globe in 85, first just to cover cops and robbers and stuff, but I really wanted to do other things. And like after, I think it would have been after, trying to think it might have been 1988, the Gibraltar killings, or it might have been when Michael Stone opened fire on one of the funerals in Belfast and in Milltown.
Yeah.
One of our older correspondents was over there and he covered it, but the guy was pretty old, and I knew that was the story. So I asked him if I could cover it. And he said, well, you're going to have to, the new London bureau chief is Steve Erlanger. And Steve is now with the New York Times, extremely distinguished journalist. He was the bureau chief in London at the time. And I said, I asked him, I said, I have this fascination with this story. I went to school in Ireland. We need to spend more time on the Northern Ireland story. And Steve, I ended up doing the same job as Steve. And the London Bureau means you're responsible for all of Europe.
Yeah.
So Steve was more than happy because as far as he was concerned, London was a kip. So he goes, if you want it, not London, Belfast was a kip. And he goes, if you want that story, it's all yours, kid.
Yeah.
So that's when I first started going over there in the late 80s.
And you were affected by that trip you took up and met the British paratroop or the British Army chap. And that
would have been... That would have been the spring of 1980.
You were still in Trinity then, weren't you?
I was, and I went up there, and I had a couple of friends. They were Protestant kids from Carrickfergus.
Yeah,
one was from Lisburn, a real loyalist town, and Carrickfergus, and I went up there to see them. But I arrived on the bus in Belfast, and I just said I'm gonna go. So I walked around the falls and I later walked around the Shankill too, because I didn't know what I was naive. I know. So they found out my name was Kevin Cullen. They would put me on a spit.
Yeah.
So, but I'm on the falls and I'm walking down around Divis Flats and just looking up at the towers up there and the British helicopters landing and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, I'm surrounded by a British Army patrol. And, they said, what are you doing? And I start just talking. And one of them said something to the effect like, knock off the phony accent or phony Yank accent. I go, I'm an American. And I went to, reach for my passport. He hit me. And I was like, and I remember at that very moment, I think, if this is how they treat Americans,
imagine.
How do they treat the locals? And it really had a profound impact on me. I was 20 years old, Rossa.
Wow.
And I didn't know I was going to be a newspaper reporter and be back in that very place 8 years later. But there I was. And so, but I think you and I talked about this, the idea of, having a name and heritage like mine. When I went to Northern Ireland as a reporter, I kind of often wished my name was like Richard Rodriguez or something like that, because I think it brought so many assumptions with it.
Yeah.
So Republicans assumed I was sympathetic to their cause.
Yeah.
Loyalists assumed I was
the opposite
hostile to theirs.
Yeah. And
it took me a long time, but I think eventually I was able to convince them, I'm just here for the story.
Yeah.
I'm not on anybody's side. But, that doesn't mean that I took the he said, she said, or that one side has just as much a, legitimate grievance as the other, because that's not true. And the bottom line is, when I started going to the north of Ireland, the discrimination, the grievances held in the Catholic nationalist community were serious and sincere, and they needed attention. I was there throughout that process, in which I think that the British government finally figured out that the way to address the grievances, or the way to address the political unrest and the violence that sprung from the 70s, or actually the late 60s, was to address those grievances because they were genuine.
Yeah.
There was incredible housing discrimination. There was discrimination in every form. Whenever the government, the unionist government, had any kind of power, whether it was housing, whether it was education, Catholic nationalists would discriminate against. And, that was the greatest recruiting method for the provost, for the IRA. And then Margaret Thatcher's, intransigence during the hunger strikes was, again, I would say, Margaret Thatcher did more to recruit members of the IRA than Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams ever did. That's my line. I've always believed that. And I saw it with my own eyes. I talked to enough people, paramilitaries on both sides, to understand why they chose what they chose. And I tried not to judge, because, again, I was like a working class kid. And I would think that, man.
But it clearly comes across, Kevin. I mean, obviously, apart from Bozo pushing you to educate and you taught history, writing is part of it. But it's the way you think and your passion, given the stuff you've been involved with the Globe after your move, like Spotlight, Chasing the Truth on Whitey, Bulger, the Marathon. You have a quest in your head or a drive to find the truth or the reality. You're not afraid of confronting facts and figures and information.
No, because, it's weird because, since 2007, I've been a columnist, and I'm entitled to engage. In fact, I'm encouraged to engage in opinion. But
you're like the Mark Barnacle now, are you?
No, not that far. I don't make the kind of money that Mike makes. That's for sure. I mean, Barnacle was a very good friend of me over the years, and Jimmy Breslin was a very strong influence on me. And I didn't really get to know Jimmy until after, when I worked on the church stuff.
Yeah.
The Spotlight team on the cover up of the sexual abuse of minors by priests. Breslin called me out of the blue, and he was famously gruff.
Yeah.
What are you working on?
Yeah.
I go, who's this? He goes, it's Breslin. I go, Jimmy Breslin? He says, yeah. What are you working on? So that was our introduction. So, but then we became, great pals. And I like I said, I read everything that Breslin did, and I really admired him. And Breslin always, and I remember Pete Hamill, whose family are from Belfast. Pete, I remember we were talking about Breslin after he died. Oh no, was it before? It was before he died. When we had a big time for him down at NYU, we had a big testimony, as Jimmy called it. It was a wake before he died. Wonderful, and he hated that. Jimmy hated that. Yeah. He told that one. But Pete Hamill I thought the way he put it while Breslin was entitled to engage in overt opinion, he really did, because he let his subjects tell the story, and you had you were under no illusions where Breslin's sympathies lay. And I kind of try to model myself after that. I mean, I'm not even remotely comparing myself to Jimmy Breslin, because he was incomparable in the number of books he wrote, and I think he was the best American columnist in the history of American newspapers. So I'm not even, I couldn't carry his notebook, but he really did influence me in terms of that way to approach opinion journalism or being a columnist. That the strongest opinion you can have is rooted in facts, and your opinion is even stronger if someone else states it. And so I've tried to adopt that, with limited success over the years. But and that was the way I felt in Ireland. I really tried to play it straight when I was a reporter, but I couldn't ignore horrible things.
Yeah.
So when the real IRA blew up people in Omaha,
and you walked around,
I saw.
Yeah.
And I wasn't couching in it that they had every right to do this because of historical discrimination. Yeah. That's crap.
Yeah.
They killed women and children.
And you saw it there yourself.
And same when I remember being one of the most horrible things I covered. When I talk about this, Ross, to this day, I get really upset. There were 3 little boys in Ballymena, the Quinn brothers. And it was after the deal was done. It was after Good Friday. Then we thought peace was coming, but there were a lot of people who didn't want it. And some of them were loyalist paramilitaries. And they, lit a house on fire that was, I think it was a drug dealer who wasn't paying them or whatever. And there were 3 little boys up there, the Quinn brothers, and they burned to death. And the next day I went down there and I talked to the people, because I was up there covering Portadown and the standoff at Drum Cree, which I did every summer. Mm-hmm. I would say my friends went to Cape Cod in the summer and I went to Portadown. Trust me, I'd rather be in Cape Cod. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I went down there and I talked to the people, the locals, and there was like a little girl, and her mother allowed me to talk to her because she said the girl was friendly with one of the particular Quinn boys, and she said that they went out there in the fire and they couldn't get out the window. And she told me, this little girl told me, I heard my friend say his feet were burning, and I lost it. Mm. I started crying, and all these people who lived in this neighborhood, in this housing estate, came over and comforted me. And I remember I went back to my hotel room and I wrote that story. And what I remember is that there were tears falling on the keyboard as I wrote it. And it was especially crushing because this was just within weeks of the Good Friday Agreement being signed.
Yeah.
And we thought we were in this new era, and these old hatreds surfaced and murdered these little boys, burned them to death like they were some heretic to an old Ireland. These kids were going to be the future of Ireland, and the old Ireland killed them.
How did you get the resilience to deal with those situations, Kev?
How did I what?
The resilience or the strength to carry on.
I don't know.
How does F1 turn data into insights at 200 miles per hour? AWS is how fans get inside the strategy. AWS powers next-level innovation for millions of businesses.
Grief doesn't keep a calendar. Anxiety doesn't clock out after 5. Depression doesn't care if it's your busy season. But support can still fit into your life. With Grow, you can find a therapist who meets you where you are. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions. You can search by insurance, provider specialty, treatment methods, and more to find a therapist who works for you. And if it's not the right fit, switching is easy. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Find therapy on your time. Evenings, weekends, and cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/ACAST today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/ACAST. growtherapy.com/ACAST. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
it's how to explain that as a human being, it's the hardest thing to go through something like that.
Yeah.
And I think the trauma cumulatively really kind of affected me years later. But at the time, you're just thinking, how do I best tell this story? How do I best honor the memory of somebody who's killed like this and murdered for? And again, I just never accepted. I get mentally that this had to happen. That there was a way. What's that? The Paul Brady song, "The Island."
Yeah,
How this twisted wreckage down on Main Street is going to bring us all together in the end.
Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing is, years later, when I was based in London, I called Paul Brady to do a profile of me. Got pissed off. He goes, "How'd you get my number?" I said, "Well, Jesus, I'm a newspaper reporter."
Yeah.
He goes, "Yeah, well, don't call it again." But he hung up.
That's Paul.
That's the other thing. I mean, I laugh with people because I've had people have said very complimentary things about me covering Ireland, and I'm the American guy that knows it, and I'm blah blah blah. But the other thing I remember, I was with John Hume and Pat, his wife, and we were having a meal in Donegal, not in Derry, because John and Pat very regularly went to Donegal and had a place there. And so I don't know, John and Pat were talking about, what are you working? And I mentioned that I wanted to do a profile of Brian Friel. And Pat says, "Oh, I'm very close to Brian. I'm very friendly with Brian." I said, "Well, geez, do you think
you will
put a word in for me?" And she goes, "Absolutely, Kevin, absolutely." And I got to tell you, Ross, I liked John Hume. I loved Pat. And I've told Aiden, their son, that how much I just adored her. She was and I think she was kind of underappreciated. I think she'll be appreciated in history because without Pat, there's no John.
Yeah.
Anyway, so she made the call to Bryce. So she gave me his cell number. And I don't know if it was the next day or the day after. I was in that part of the country for a while. And I called Brian Friel and he answered the phone. He said to me, "Oh, yeah. I said, "Wait, I think Pat, yeah, she called me." I said, "So is there a chance we could sit down this week while I'm here?" He goes, "No, there's not." And I said, "Well, it's just sometime I have to go back to London, but maybe we could speak by phone." He goes, No, that's not going to happen." And I said, "Well, I thought you said that Pat." He goes, "Listen, I love Pat Hume. She's a lovely woman. I told her I'd talk to you. I've talked to you." And he hung up.
Oh, classic.
And I gotta be honest. I really admired that.
Yeah, fair. That is absolutely brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. And is there a quote?
I told Seamus Heaney that story over a drink, and he says, "Yeah, that's Brian."
That's Brian. Is there a quote that travels with you, Kevin, that gives you strength, or you resort to, or you help to reflect?
I just mentioned Seamus. I don't know. It's not the quote that it's not something that there are all sorts of, inspirational things said by Irish people from Yeats to, I've often quoted Oscar Wilde, who said that the definition of a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Yeah. I always loved that one. But I very often, in terms of my favorite Irish quote, I think it would have to be Seamus Heaney. And we had a funny relationship, Seamus and I. We used to fly over when he was at Harvard.
Yeah.
A few times we flew over on the Aer Lingus together. And there was a woman who ran when Aer Lingus actually had offices in real cities like Boston. Yeah. There was a woman named Noreen Courtney who ran the Aer Lingus office, and she was this tiny little, sweet as could be. Again, and one of my aunts. Whenever I would see Noreen, I said, "That's my aunt. That's my Aunt Kay. That's my Aunt May." And she would always bump me and Seamus up. And this was before Seamus won the Nobel. So It's not like he was swimming in money. Poets didn't make a ton of money back then. And he really didn't come into money until after the Nobel Prize. So we were poor. I was a newspaper guy. It's like the Globe's not going to send me over to Ireland on first class. So Noreen would boot me up. I think I don't have an exact number, but I'd say 3 or 4 times Seamus and I sat either next to each other or within talking distance in first class on Aer Lingus. And we got friendly. He knew what I did. I knew what he did. And so we had famously a great night together after he won the Nobel Prize, but he came back to lecture at Harvard. And he came into the greatest living, certainly American, what would you call it, writer who understood Seamus was Helen Vendler at Harvard.
Yeah.
And I did a Nieman Fellowship in 2002, 2003 at Harvard. And I went to Helen and asked her if I could be in the class, because as a Nieman Fellow, you're entitled to take classes at all levels, whether it be at Harvard Business School, Harvard Law School, the college for undergrads. And she taught this was an undergraduate. And she said, Kevin, I know you, I like you, I admire your work from Ireland, but these kids, 30% of their grade is based on participation. So if you're there, I said, well, Helen, what if I just keep my mouth shut? Don't talk. She looked at me like over her glass. You can do that? I said, yeah, I will. I won't say that. I won't do that. And so she let me audit the class. And it was a seminar. It was like 12 kids.
Yeah.
And so one day, Seamus comes walking in and he looks around, greets everybody. And then he looks at me and he didn't say anything, but he just gave me that sly look. And so anyway, after class, and he was classic Seamus, he was self-effacing. He was very interested in the students. They really responded to him. He was so good to these kids. And these were young kids. They were like probably sophomores, juniors. And anyway, the class ends, and Seamus came up to me. He just had a surprised look on his face. And I think it's because I kept my mouth shut. And I think he found that hard to believe. So he says, what are you doing later? I said, nothing.
Yeah,
He goes, stop by Thompson Hall about 5:30. We'll take it from there. I go, okay. So I went to Thompson Hall, is where the English department at Harvard is, and that's where Seamus would have spent his time when he lectured a lot more regularly. Yeah, he would spend a whole semester there before the Nobel. So anyway, I go there, and this is classic Seamus. He brought me in, and he introduced me to everybody within an arse's roar of the office. He introduced me to custodians. He introduced me to librarians. He introduced me to his secretary. And this is what he said. Her name was Sheila. He said, Sheila, this is Kevin. Kevin, this is Sheila. Sheila, Kevin is a journalist. Tell him nothing. And it was a sly reworking of my favorite Irish phrase, which is Seamus when he said, and it was obviously referring to the North, whatever you say nothing.
Say nothing.
And I always said that captured that sort of, it captures the complexity and the elasticity of language, the way the Irish use it.
Yeah.
And certainly in the peace process, where I think both, John Hume, Jerry Adams, Martin McGuinness on the nationalist side used that elasticity to great effect and got the deal over the line. They told the Unionists what they needed to hear. They told their own people what they needed to hear. And the truth was somewhere in the middle, And so anyway, so Seamus and I retired to this place, lovely place called Daedalus, after the character from Joyce.
Yeah.
On Mount Auburn Street in back of Adams' house, which is where I was. When you're a Nieman Fellow, you get affiliated with a house.
Yeah. I
was affiliated with Adams' house. So I went there every week for lunch. I gave lectures. I talked to the kids, tutored some kids. And that's where Seamus was affiliated. Yeah. He lived in Adams' house. And that night he said, so we're leaving to go to Daedalus. And he says, listen, I have to be home. The masters are having the house masters were Judy and Sean, who they ran the house, and they were also practicing pediatricians with the poorest kids in Boston. I love these people, so I'm not going to screw them. I go, hey, Seamus, we'll have a couple of drinks, and you can go to dinner with Sean and Judy. Well, anyway, the other thing I remember about that night in Daedalus, Seamus introduced me to all these people, and they weren't like tenured professors or famous people. They were the custodians at the Widener Library. All these people, like working people at Harvard, were coming up and saying they were so glad to see him because he hadn't been around.
So, Kevin, what piece of music has traveled with you through the good years and the bad years that you always turn to?
I'd say I always go back to Michael Russell, the Clairman and virtuoso of the tin whistle, anything he did. But one of the songs that stays with me is The Cliffs of Moher, which I think is from that album, Under the Cliffs of Moher. But I had when I was 20 years old and I was a student at Trinity, I hitchhiked out to Dublin with my guitar, a guitar I bought at a pawn shop near my bed sitting Ranelagh. And I walked into Gus O'Connor's pub because my buddy Con O'Brien from Dolphins Barn said, if you go out there, you got to go there. And I found this old farmer, and there was nobody in the pub except this farmer with shit-caked wellies sitting there and the lady behind the bar. I had no idea who Michael Russell was. I was really just getting into Irish traditional music, and the woman behind the bar more or less bade me to play my guitar with the farmer. So I walked over and sat next to him. He pulled out his tin whistle, and he asked me what I knew. And I didn't really know anything Irish beyond like the Tommy Makem and Clancy Brothers songs.
Usually, yeah.
Even then, I knew I was just savvy enough to know that that's not what the real traditional musicians in the Gaeltacht were playing. So I told Maiko, who I didn't know was Maiko. I mean, he did introduce himself as Maiko, but I had no idea it was Michael Russell. I told him I knew a lot of Eagles and Neil Young. He goes, "Oh, that's great, great, great." So I remember we played Take It Easy and a couple of Eagles songs, and then some songs off the Neil Young album Harvest, which I knew. And I remember trying to sing The Needle and the Damage Done in like this Neil Young falsetto, and I'm sure it wasn't very good, but I do remember Maiko's tin whistle was haunting in that song because it added a layer to that song, which is almost always performed as just an acoustic guitar. And after we played about a half a dozen songs, Maiko, without any ceremony, just tucked his tin whistle in his crusty tweed jacket, tipped his tweed cap at me, shook my hand, and disappeared into the night. And I'm telling you, Rasa, I think it was months, if not years, before I figured out who he was. I told that story to somebody who knew about, Doolin and O'Connor's, and they said that was Michael Russell you played with. I go, oh, geez, I don't know. And then I subsequently found out, sort of like if you put it back on like some German kids walking around and walks into a pub hundreds of years ago and plays the piano with some guy he didn't know was Beethoven.
Beethoven, yeah.
Because Michael Russell was to the tin whistle what Beethoven or Mozart was to the piano. I mean, he just was a virtuoso, and I remember his house. I found out later it looked out right over to the Aran Islands, and I just literally just a few days ago booked travel for my son Patrick and I, and we're going to go back to. We want to be in Ireland when Troy Parrott scores his next 5 goals, and. We're going to be we'll be in Dublin for the match against the Czech Republic, and probably watch it my old haunt in Dunleary, McKenna's Arthur.
Great spot. Great spot.
Nice pint, and it's a nice pub. It's not big, And then we'll probably be, and we believe they will, move on to that second playoff game. We hope to be in Doolin for that. We'll probably be at O'Connor's and McCann's and listen to some real good music, and we'll take the ferry from Doolin over
I was going to ask you, you probably fly now, would you? A big Mr. Flahulak fly. We're going to go by ferry. Stick to the ferry.
Exactly.
And if you're in McKenna's next March, give me a call.
I will. I'll give you a shout.
Kevin Cullen, thank you very much for joining us on Aran Island This.
Thanks, Ross. It was a great trip down memory lane.
How does F1 turn data into insights at 200 miles per hour? AWS is how fans get inside the strategy. AWS powers next-level innovation for millions of businesses.
The McDonald's Snack Wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch Snack Wrap. Spicy Snack Wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack Wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.